President of Singapore said last week that he would like to have Singapore become a more smart and technologically advanced country. So please try to use the technology. I have got one question already. It does work, and it's not very difficult. So I'd like to welcome everyone once again. My name is Nicholas from the Institute of International Affairs. A very warm welcome to Minkit, Peter, and thank you, Sunny, for really doing a great job in framing, I think, some of the issues and some of the challenges that we're facing. I would like to dispute that I think the Spanish were wrong. If I miss one meal, I start to get irritable already. So it's not just about 7 meals. But thank you very much for that. Before we open the floor and have a bit of a discussion with all the participants and delegates here, I'd like to invite our two panelists who are joining us now to share some of their thoughts, maybe about 5 or 10 minutes worth of opening ideas on the topic of resources and sustainability, and whether or not we are able to find a middle ground between these two concepts. I think Sunny has spelled out very clearly some of the challenges that we face, some of the issues that corporations and large countries are likely to experience in the decades ahead, in terms of the tension between the demand for food and resources and the need for corporations to obviously carry on as going concerns, but incorporate sustainability as some of their key policies as well. So to kick that off, I'd like to invite Peter to share some thoughts. Accenture has been heavily involved in looking at the issue of sustainability. And I believe, Peter, you have some thoughts to share with us on the UN Global Compact Accenture CEO study on sustainability that was carried out last year, which involved companies making pledges to sustainability in light of their own operations as well. So some of your thoughts, please.
So thank you very much indeed, and firstly an apology, which is that the moderator mentioned at the beginning that some of us have just flown in overnight, so if I'm not quite as sharp as normal, I should at least give thanks to the organisers, because we feel like we're being interrogated with the brightest lights I think I've ever seen in a panel session, so hopefully that'll keep us up. So let me first of all say I thought that Sunny did an excellent job of framing the problem. I think it makes for depressing, but I think honest assessment of some of the challenges that we're going to face in the next generation in terms of tackling this issue of resource scarcity, this issue of resource efficiency, and how to really power the next waves of growth with different models. So the advantage of that is that I can more or less throw away my notes because all the statistics have gone and just get straight into the heart of the discussion, because I think what I'd like to do is just to say a few words helping to move the debate from that issue of the sets of challenges, complex and interrelated as they are, towards, I think, what is the emerging architecture for the solutions. I think you mentioned the UN Global Compact, maybe just as a bit of a setup. Each 3 years, I lead a study for the UN Secretary General. First one was for Kofi Annan, and then most recently the last two have been for Ban Ki-moon. And it's the largest CEO study conducted on sustainability. And the idea is very simple. The idea is to give the UN leadership the understanding of what's on the minds of chief executives as they look to integrate sustainability into the core of their businesses, and really what it is that they need from policymakers to create more effective public policy, public-private policy partnerships and platforms. And in the last one, we surveyed about 1,000 CEOs, slightly more than 1,000, so it was the largest of its kind to date, from right around the world, from more than 100 countries, from 27 different industries. And I think there are a few things that are worthwhile in just putting on the table. I think the first is that it's not an issue of awareness or importance anymore to executives. If you ask those 1,000 CEOs, more than 93% of them will tell you that sustainability is important and is going to be critical for their future competitive advantage. They know that it's here, they know it's not going to disappear, they know these forces that Sunny has mentioned are becoming increasingly powerful in shaping the economics of their industries beyond purely the moral case that we have on some of these issues. But, and I think this is an important but, they also recognize that we are absolutely not on track to manage those sets of challenges as we currently look at the state of the global economy. So less than 31% of those same CEOs told us that they believed that business was doing enough on sustainability at a global level. And I think that when you take a step back and you look at some of the data points, we are on the edge of an industrial revolution. We are going to see, I think, over the next 40 years, a next era of an industrial revolution. Part of it will be linked to digital technologies, but part of it will be linked to this extraordinary growth challenge and dilemma that we're going to need to meet in terms of resource scarcity and resource availability. And we didn't really even touch on climate change, because actually climate change, I mean, you touched on it lightly, but actually it exacerbates all of the other problems. And so when you look at Nick Stern, for example, who conducted the Stern report, he will tell you, if you look at the next 40 years and you look at the fact that the global economy should triple approximately, and we need to get global carbon emissions from somewhere in the mid-40 gigatons down to somewhere in the mid-20s. If you look at that equation, what we're actually saying is that we need the whole economy to be 7 or 8 times more efficient. Which, when you think about that, you say, well, okay, that sounds doable. But in a 40-year period, that means that every bottle of water needs to have a carbon intensity, or take that as a proxy for energy and resource use. It's going to have to be in the region of 12 or 13% of the amount that's currently going into it in terms of natural resources. And in a 40-year period, either in engineering technology or any other form of model you want to think about, that is an extraordinary transformation. Now, here's the solution side of that. On the one hand, that's pretty frightening. But on the other hand, when you think about the enormous disruption and sets of new opportunities that's going to create for markets, for new players, for players who can move quickly to tackle these issues, it's really very exciting. And I think that the most powerful concept, and one that I was speaking about yesterday in China, where I live, and I'm just heading off to Manila to the World Economic Forum in East Asia to talk about this tomorrow, is the circular economy. And actually, that the heart of the circular economy is rethinking the paradigm of production and consumption over the last 200 years. And this linear cycle of production and consumption, the idea of take, make, and dispose. And actually rethinking that fundamentally to decouple growth from natural resource use, and to find a way of doing more with less. Because I totally agree with your 5th and 6th points. You cannot isolate this issue of resource efficiency from the issue of inequality, and the idea of equitable development. And so we can't possibly say, actually we've used all the resources globally, sorry, time to stop. India, China, we had ours, don't worry about it. You don't have that opportunity because we can't think of new ways and means of framing this debate and model. That doesn't fly. Equally, I advise lots of CEOs and chairmen and boards around the world. I don't know a single one, albeit maybe intellectually robust, who would seriously consider a business model that was about either no growth or actually slow growth by design. So we're going to have to come up with new ways of thinking in terms of technology, in terms of business models, that actually makes capitalism, makes products and services restorative, not just a negative impact on society. And I'm pretty confident that we can do that. 2 final remarks. When I look at the issue of the circular economy, the 2 things that at the moment I find extremely exciting are the emergent sets of business models that are beginning to disrupt industries at the margins. I want to be very clear, the circular economy is not with us here and now, absolutely not. But we are seeing signs at the margins that there are models that can go to scale in things like rethinking inputs in value chains and industries. So moving away from sometimes some of the less recyclable, less reusable at the end of life cycle, to areas modeled on areas like biomimicry. Thinking about output recovery, thinking about how we get back material at the end of life cycles, thinking about product life extension, thinking about how we move beyond this short-term disposable set of products and services that we've developed over the last 20 or 30 years in consumerism. Thinking about sharing platforms. Many of you have seen a lot recently about the sharing economy. And at the heart of the sharing economy, many of those things you see like Airbnb or Lyft or carpooling is actually about more efficient use of expensive assets that people own. I'm told that even just an automated car sharing pool here in Singapore would cut the amount of cars required from 800,000 to 300,000 just by the efficiency of the asset. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of companies move into the whole model of product as a service. And when you shift from products to services, you often have a far greater incentive to design for the long term, to design for disassembly, to take things back. And what we're finding, and this is my second final point, I think, is that this digital revolution that's taking place in parallel, social media, mobility, cloud computing, analytics, the Internet of Things, is creating an enormous set of enablers that can really drive us to think differently about take, make, waste towards a circular economy, towards cradle to cradle instead of cradle to grave. And so for me, I think Sunny gave an excellent overview of the set of the challenges. For me, the circular economy is beginning to show us signs of how we can get out of this challenging dilemma.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think we've touched on some very interesting ideas and probably bears a little bit more discussion during the question and answer. But before we get to that, I'd like to invite Ming-Kit to share some thoughts. The Singapore Business Federation is, of course, the apex business chamber in Singapore, representing around 18,000 companies here. So Ming-Kit, perhaps some of your thoughts on how Singapore companies, potentially the SMEs that Pak Agus mentioned in his opening remarks, how are they viewing the issues of sustainability and marrying their business processes, and some of your thoughts on perhaps the Asia Pacific Leadership Sustainability Forum as well.
Thank you, Nicholas. Fellow panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As Nicholas said, the Singapore Business Federation is the apex business chamber in Singapore. Our membership numbers have increased. We are now 21,000 member companies in the federation. We have a mix of both large and small companies. We have about 70% of our members are SMEs. So you can find in SBF a broad view of corporate sentiments, particularly among the smaller companies. Sustainability is a key agenda of our members. We had formed a sustainability development business group with more than 500 of our members keen to either adopt sustainability practices or who can provide sustainable solution as a business. So this group was formed about 4 years ago, and we're quite pleased that our sustainability events have gained traction over the years. Let me start by sharing with you our annual Asia Pacific Sustainability Leadership Forum. Last year, we invited Minister Vivian Balakrishnan to talk about the issue of transboundary haze. We were at the height of the haze pollution then last June. There were lots of concerns over health, economic loss, and also anger over irresponsible agriculture practices. We had a good panel discussion with the minister on the haze issue. The key takeaway are that the issues of the haze is complex. There is a spectrum of challenges that needs to be addressed: livelihood of farmers, good agricultural practices, governance and enforcement. And there is a need for ownership across many stakeholders, and any resolution will take considerable time and effort. Sustainable agriculture was also a key agenda to be promoted so that sustainability can be driven as an integral part of the value chain. During the forum, the minister shared that he's exploring legislative measures to make companies accountable for unacceptable agricultural practices. The Ministry of Environment and Water Resources subsequently drafted the Transboundary Haze Pollution Bill in February this year for public consultation, and earlier this month in Jakarta, the minister announced that the bill would be tabled in Parliament in the second half of this year. Another key takeaway from the forum was the need for CEOs to push the sustainability agenda. This was very encouraging because we were seeing more companies linking sustainability with business strategy. Following the forum, we had an event last month in April where we had a roundtable on sustainability with our members. There was good discussion on the issues and the pain points faced. We polled on these issues, and what came out on top was how to balance between making convenient choices and doing the right thing. So this, I think this is not a coincidence that this is what this panel is all about, finding the middle ground to do business in a responsible manner. In helping our SMEs to make those difficult choices, we have been working to set up a platform where CEOs who are already embracing sustainability could champion the cause and inspire and influence the rest of the business community. For the platform to work, it needs to be issue-centric, and it needs to engage the business community. We are going to make these key elements of this platform. We're still finalizing the details of this platform, which we will make public at the later part of this year. Meanwhile, I'm very encouraged that more and more companies are making sustainability, taking sustainability more seriously. We have been seeing a good level of participation from companies of around 40 each year in our Singapore Sustainability Awards. We are also happy to see a gradual but steady increase in the responses and awardees that subscribe to these awards. We also understand from Singapore Compact, who did a study recently with the NUS Business School, that there has been a healthy increase in the number of companies publishing GRI sustainability reports, up from just 10 companies in 2011. I think in order to move our SMEs up the sustainability curve, companies are going to need help, both in overcoming their issues as well as some form of standards or targets to work towards. For the former, I think I spoke earlier about setting up the CEO-led platform as a body to help them. As for standards, the most internationally accepted will be the GRI Sustainability Reporting Framework. GRI has become a global benchmark for all companies serious about sustainability, but it will take time to move all companies into GRI. The number of companies from Singapore Compact study is still low, and there's much to be done to get more companies to firstly publish sustainability report and then seriously adopt GRI standards. I have outlined a few initiatives that SPF has been working on to push the sustainability agenda for our Singapore companies. We're happy that our efforts to help our members to embrace sustainability are gaining traction. Much of this has to do with ensuring we focus on topics and issues that are relevant to our members. I'm also happy to note that government, through Spring and IE Singapore, has been supportive through funding, not only of the cost of our programs, and I think government has a big role to play as an important stakeholder in lending regulatory weight, what it needs to engender behavior change for companies. So I think this is sustainability for the Singapore business community is, I think we've gone beyond the stage of awareness. We're making progress, but I think it is there's still a lot more that needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minkit. I think we've done a pretty good job moving from a very broad look at global issues and challenges to potentially some more concrete methods, and then drilling down to the situation in Singapore. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience who is not a technophobe like myself for taking this plunge and sending your questions via the pigeonhole. We do have a good range of questions. Some of these actually that have been sent in actually pertain to issues of financial institutions and financing of the industry, which we're actually going to address in the later panel in the afternoon. So you forgive me if I don't take those questions now. We will address them in the afternoon. But to kick things off, we heard a little bit about some of the things that companies are already looking at. Peter, you talked about some potential technologies that could be game changers in the ways companies try to marry the ideas of profitability and sustainability. One of the questions we have coming through that is from Fitrian is, what sort of new or innovative breakthroughs are needed from the private sector's point of view to significantly change current practices towards more responsible and sustainable practices? So I guess the question is whether or not something needs to flip the switch, as it were, and then nudge companies to actually becoming more responsible. We've heard how awareness is getting there, and there's some practices, but does something need to shift the needle significantly? And I open this up to anybody on the panel who might have some thoughts on that.
So I think when you're talking about something as fundamental as the shift to what essentially, using the term very carefully for those of you who are sort of scientists from a Kuhn perspective, you know, a paradigm shift. I think we are talking about a paradigm shift. That clearly can't be tackled with one single intervention or one. I think our colleague from Indonesia mentioned there's no silver bullet here, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to think carefully about what are some of those conditions and what could drive that shift. I'm an advisor to the World Economic Forum on this topic, on resource efficiency, and for the last few years we've been working with a group of the consumer goods industry companies and across other sectors as well, some of the enablers and partners of the consumer goods industry. And I think in one of the reports we produced a couple of years ago, which is part of an extensive stakeholder consultation around this idea of the circular economy, was called More with Less. And at the core of the More with Less set of recommendations was that we needed to make moves on all three fronts of supply. So we need to rethink and re-engineer the way we think about supply side in procurement, in logistics, in manufacturing, and thinking through the advances that we can deploy to the supply side. And the business is predominantly responsible for that. You know, that's very much in the business domain and within our ability to work and partner in some cases with new research and universities and so on, but it's within our grasp. I think then on the other side of the equation, we need demand to shift. I think a few people have mentioned today that predominantly consumers are not prepared to pay a premium for sustainability in any sense. To my mind, neither necessarily should they. But they're certainly not prepared to pay. They still have very traditional buying behaviors: availability, price, quality. Sustainability is in there increasingly somewhere, but not as a trade-off. They're not prepared to accept those trade-offs. So there are a whole series of things we need to do on the demand side, where we do need to be able to show how this can be a differentiator, all other things being equal, for companies and products and services in their brands, in that brand promise that you see. But also we're going to have to look at public education campaigns. I think you mentioned your children this comes very naturally to them in certain areas. That's going to take generations of shift in terms of rethinking the way we use products and service, dispose of them. And then the third thing is rules of the game. So supply, demand, rules of the game. We absolutely know, and it was clear from the UN CEO study, 1,000 CEOs around the world, CEOs are not against good regulation on this topic. They're not. I mean, there's a sort of a myth which is that CEOs and businesses as a whole just blankly reject all forms of regulation and intervention, and it's simply not the case. Good companies want a level playing field so that actually the kinds of performance that is rewarded by the markets, and that is absolutely essential. And I think the biggest part of that, and probably the biggest game changer, to go back to the question, is pricing some of these externalities. So actually I think the pricing of carbon, the pricing of water, the pricing of some of these natural resources, so it can just be reflected in the economics, and the best companies will then win as the innovators. I think that will be an important step.
Oh, thanks very much. You actually raised a couple of issues that tie into some of the other questions. There's one question for Sunny, and it pertains to maybe the last point that Peter made. What urgent steps do you wish to see to make businesses price in environmental and social costs? I think towards the end of your address, you mentioned the relative proportions in terms of profit, revenue, and cost to the environment. What is the next step that we need to make to actually make businesses price this in? You mentioned Puma was very progressive in coming out and doing it voluntarily. Should we do something to make businesses do that as well?
I think before we disclose what the footprint is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or water footprint or bio-waste footprint, the first thing to do is to measure it, and it is extremely complicated. So it took us 5 years to map what our footprint is across 65 countries, 16 platforms, both in terms of water, in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. So we discovered after the 5-year exercise that in our manufacturing facilities, the 55 tier 1 facilities, or the 114 facilities that we have, last year we consumed 4.6 million cubic meters of water. But in our farming operations, we consumed 350 million cubic meters of water. And from the suppliers and growers from whom we bought the rest of the produce where we were sourcing and originating, they consumed about 26.3 billion cubic meters of water. So first is to understand what is the footprint. And within that, we found that for every ton of rice that we are supplying, we are generating 13.8 tons of carbon dioxide. For every ton of almond that we supply, we generate 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide. Did I have a clue what that footprint was before? No. I'd like to know how many firms in this room really have a precise sense and measurement of what that footprint is. And the same thing goes to carbon dioxide emissions. So 2.3 million tons of carbon dioxide we emitted last year in terms of our scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 was 0.2. Scope 3, which is our supply chain, was 22 million tons. So we are now making public hard commitments on how much we will reduce our footprint by 2015, 2020. And we will continue to provide those hard targets. So we want to grow profitably, but as Peter says, we want to do it with more capital, with more resource productivity, to have better productivity in the way we use resources. The second is, I think, enforcement. I mean, the Indonesian haze is principally, if you cut through all the bullshit, lack of enforcement. And we can sit here and talk about why it is happening every year, etc. But unless people are put behind bars, if they violate willful burning of forests, there is not going to be any change, and we can keep talking as much as we want, nothing will happen. So as Peter mentioned when he's closing about regulation, this is not bad regulation. It is not about, I am a markets person. I believe there should be more markets, less government. But if it is the question of environment, because we are not sensitized to it, we are getting away with murder. And we are definitely leaving a much poorer planet for our future generations. So there, I think, if it is a level playing field, if the regulation is uniformly imposed, if it is just that one company does it, everybody looks at that company and says, the cost of doing business, just for us, if you're disadvantaged, why would we sort of adopt it? But having a level playing field and saying that there is a cost. The government in Australia, while it was the first, probably the second country that introduced a carbon tax, it lost its elections. And I think one of the reasons it lost its elections was because of the carbon tax. The carbon markets that World Bank and everybody said they will support, there was no follow through. So it's really about first measurement, second enforcement, and third pricing these. There are $1.1 trillion of subsidies given for resources last year. If water is given to you free, will you be mindful about how you use that water? How many of us really bother? Even in Singapore, where water is fairly priced, how many of us will leave the tap running while we brush our teeth or while we're shaving? Just a habit. We don't really value it. So there has to be a cost, and then there's the right economic incentives to influence change of behavior. And I think all these three things need to happen.
We'll come back to some of those ideas a bit later, but now there's a question that perhaps I'll throw to Menkit for his thoughts. And it's again building on something that Peter mentioned. A question comes in, when you talk about sustainable supply, it can be controlled through certification of products, for example. But how about the demand side of the equation? Is there any way that the consumer side can be influenced to have a positive effect on sustainability? Is it a question of raising awareness of sustainable products? Is this something that SMEs, for example, can try to leverage on instead of looking at it as a burden?
I think for SMEs, where they play in the sustainability agenda, it's not this big picture thing, but really in terms of, I mean, they're providing simple consumer products or services for their customer is really that singular relationship for a lot of them between them, what they provide and to the consumer. So I think for SMEs, whether it is, say, a pest company or a company manufacturing food stuff, to tell their customers of their business model or their products are sustainability made or resource, I think for them, I think it's an important and probably a relevant agenda as far as these companies are concerned. It is not our mission in the Federation to be looking at, not our main mission to be looking at changing or influencing consumer behavior. That's not the core duty of the Federation. But that's not to say that we are not entirely uninvolved. I do believe that we can work together with NGOs and consumer goods, consumer organizations to make changes. I was told, I think WWF came to see us and they wanted a collaboration last year during the haze, whether we can make some headways in terms of changing consumer behavior for palm oil. And I'm not sure whether WWF is here today. I think they made some change in terms of the public campaign on shark's fin. But if you look at it from the business side, there was only a mixed bag of businesses who actually came on. Some restaurants came on, some did not. So if you don't have every actor in place, I think it's not going to, you're not going to have that level playing field that Sunny talked about. But I must say that, and I must comment that from the WWF point of view, I think they have made a commendable effort as far as, say, this issue of shark's fin. Whether, in fact, a similar campaign on palm oil is going to be equally successful, I really don't know. I think it's going to be a lot more complicated in the case of palm oil. So that is something for which I think the jury is still out. But this is not something which is at the core of what we think that we should be doing as a federation. But I think as far as the sustainability agenda is concerned for SMEs, I think this simple thing about telling their consumers that the way they make their product or they provide their services is done in a sustainability way is anything important and relevant part of their business. Yeah.
I think the issue of palm oil in products especially it is very complex, given that the pervasiveness of palm oil in so many different things that we use, and creating a kind of certification might be a tricky issue as well, as Minkit mentioned. But I think we've heard a lot of views from the private sector perspective, and one of the questions that's come in is about whether the public sector can do something to help companies cope with the possible loss that's incurred by the trade-off caused by efforts to mitigate climate change and to be more sustainable. Sunny, maybe I will turn to you and get some of your thoughts before bouncing the questions to anybody else. Do you think the public sector, the government, should take on some responsibility to incentivize companies to go green?
Not in the form of subsidies, because as I said, there's already massive resource subsidies being given in most countries, even countries that can't afford it. Last year, for example, the OECD countries put together paid out $370 billion to the farmers as farm subsidies. And the people who received these subsidies were not really poor people who couldn't afford to farm. So the Charles Schwab family, for example, got $1.4 million of subsidies for a 17,000-acre rice ranch that they had in California. Scottie Pippen, the basketball player, got $500,000 of subsidy because he's also got a hobby, which is a farm somewhere or the other. In the European Union, Her Majesty the Queen was the largest subsidy recipient because she's the largest landowner. So I think the subsidies are misapplied. And the dilemma that policymakers face, which is a very complex dilemma, is if you want a massive supply response, you want farmers to produce more food, you must allow for market prices to go up so that there is enough incentive for the farmers to initiate a supply response. But in most countries, what happens, like in China and India, and it's understandable why they do it, 60% of the food expenditure basket in India goes to, the consumption expenditure basket goes to food. So if there's food price inflation, governments will fall. If onion prices go up in India, the government is threatened. So the only way the government knows how to react is to put food price controls when this happens. So the issue is, how do you make sure that you are able to provide affordable food to populations, at the same time give them economic incentives to produce more and actually come up with a supply response? One quick way of doing that is this $370 billion of subsidies that the OECD has given. That can go to feeding the 900 million people that are below the poverty line and undernourished. But is it an idea that is practical and which people will take into account? I doubt it. I think the more important thing is, if we, through Google Maps, can find out every one of us in this room where we live, I can't understand why we can't find out which farm the burning is started, or which plantation or which farmer is burning. I don't think we have the moral will to follow through on enforcement. And if we don't do that, we're not going to change behavior.
Okay, we've been talking a lot. One last question, and then maybe we'll come to the floor. We've talked a lot about pricing and costs and the business models as well, but we have a question from Janice Lee, who says that sustainability is a conversation among many different stakeholders, government, corporations, farmers, and the like. But each of these stakeholders has a different time frame of interest. So how do we reconcile our vision of sustainability across these different time frames? Peter, perhaps I'll throw that to you.
Sure. I think the point is well made. I think that's true. I think that you do have a number of conflicting time horizons in terms of the focus, whether or not it's the business time horizon, which interestingly and perhaps counterintuitively is not always short term. Many of the big resource extractive industries and the bigger resource players, they're planning 20, 30 years ahead, whereas in some cases political cycles run in 4 or 5 year terms, and very rarely more than 10. So it isn't as, without going into all the details, it isn't as obvious as the usual conceived wisdom, I guess, which is that perceived wisdom that this is all about the short-term pressures of shareholders and quarterly returns and so on. It's more complicated than that. I think maybe tying the last two questions together. I think the issue about time horizons, I think that where government is functioning well as a partner and creating the boundary conditions for markets to work effectively, because I'm, same as Sunny, I'm a big believer in the power of markets, set up and incentivized with boundary conditions to get on with what they do best, which is drive growth, drive jobs, drive innovation. I think that is the most effective way we've seen to align those different time horizons, to come up with the right boundary conditions for the markets and then let the market get on with what it does best. And I think if you look at how they can go about that, and I told you earlier, I think that we need to be careful about what's happening with in a lot of countries where governments are moving in very incremental ways, and we aren't really facing an incremental set of challenges. We're facing a transformational set of challenges. And that require really a total rethink over the next 40 years of the way that our economy has worked successfully for the last 200. So I think if you look at that, it means governments need to be looking at the circular economy in terms of the policy mix. They need to be looking at it in terms of their own organizations. In most countries, government in its own right is an enormous organization. And of course, government in terms of their tax and revenues, in most economies are the biggest procurer of goods and services, again, in their own right. So starting from that position, being prepared to take almost a game board approach and actually placing bets, trying to support different forms of, as I said, things like circular inputs, output recovery, sharing platforms, products as a service, product life extension, like they've done in California, for example, like some of the Nordic countries are now doing, like Germany is now doing. Singapore has a few interesting policies, although not doing enough. And that's one of the things I'm very keen to see ASEAN and Asia as a whole pick up, because these are not necessarily counterintuitive for people in Asia. It just needs to be framed in a different way.
Thanks very much. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so we'll go to our technologically challenged old school friends in the audience who would no need to shout. We have microphones, so you can address your question, please.
Yeah, Gurmeet Singh from Malaysia. Not that I'm technology disadvantaged, but I refuse to use it now. I think we have a choice, and we must be given the choice. I want to ask this question to my Singapore friend. I'm very skeptical about SMEs in Singapore being gung-ho about sustainability, because the SMEs around this part of the world run away from environmental issues, whether they are in Malaysia or Indonesia. What more sustainability? So I just want to know, what is the dimension in Singapore that makes SMEs gung-ho about sustainability? Then on this issue of the circular economy, I'm just wondering, how are you going to implement it with the tendency to have built-in excellence into products and the high turnover in IT? You know, you look at the number of handphones people change because new models come out. What do you do with the old models? Are you going to be able to reassemble the new models? Is that something that's going to work? So I think we have to come up against these trends. How are you going to break this built-in excellence? Because when people talk about sustainable consumption and production, to have sustainable production, you must have sustainable consumption as well. How do you marry the two?
Thank you. There are a few different issues inside there. There are a few Singaporeans up here as well, but I presume your first question was directed at Ming Kit when it comes to SMEs.
I think, just to correct, I never said that any Singapore SMEs are gung-ho. I think they are far. I think what they are gung-ho is, they are gung-ho about promoting sustainability solution if it is part and parcel of the business that they offer. So I mentioned about the Sustainable Development Business Group. You know, a lot of them are SMEs there, and the reason why they're there is because they know, and they are providing environmental solutions and businesses, and they know that this is a business going forward, and their services are required not only in Singapore, around the world, and they're looking at it from providing a business point of view. So that's the first clarification. And if you look at the number of SMEs that have done reporting, very few. So I mentioned that there are 11 with sustainability reports. Most of them are listed companies, certainly not SMEs. And we have on record in Singapore about 200,000 SMEs. So the numbers speaks for themselves. So I think as Singapore SMEs are no different from SMEs and anywhere around the world. If they can get away with a more convenient choice, they would. The thing that we needed to do really is to make sure that they are aware that there are these choices that needs to be made. And I'm happy to see that more and more of them are stepping forward, looking at it beyond a business, looking at it because they are there because it's socially responsible and the right thing to do.
Thanks. The second question had a couple of parts inside: circular economy and the issue of products, and whether or not we can address some of the supply side issues. So I'll ask Peter and then perhaps Sunny as a final remark.
Well, I think our friend who refuses to use technology may actually be a technology genius by accident, because I think he has got to the heart of the issue, which is around obsolescence, in terms of both design and in terms of then consumer utilization or use and then disposal of products and services. I think that's spot on. So I think to your question, which is how do you go about changing that, I think that when you look at a business, the two parts of the organization that need to be fully aligned with those strategies are the R&D teams, who need to take a very different view through the life cycle of a product or a service as to how you use those materials and what the likely use is at different stages, using life cycle assessment, using an end-to-end approach to thinking right from the start of the design cycle about what's going to happen to that product at the end of life. And then the second thing is, I think we need to be fully engaging marketing departments. You know, marketing departments are all about creating desire, creating wants, creating needs. And this sort of obsolescence culture that you mentioned, the sort of the throwable fashion, that is something that we've created. It's not something that existed if you go back 50, 60, 70 years. And I think you're seeing really interesting examples of companies now doing this. So BMW, for example, a high-end brand, very attractive brand to the aspirational kind of rising middle classes. What you see is BMW's engineers now redesigning parts in a BMW so that 60% can be refurbished or remanufactured at the end of life cycle, but also creating a marketing campaign that it's becoming cool to actually use those parts, you know, as you go through the life cycle of your own BMW and you need it repaired. And BMW will give you a 24-month warranty on those remanufactured, reused parts, and there are other examples. And I think just because we're coming to the end, before I hand back to Sunny, I'm just picking up on Professor Simon Tay's point at the beginning of we're here also to think about very concrete measures that we can all take. And I think congratulations to the Singapore Institute for International Affairs for convening this, but also trying to get that kind of practical approach in focus. One of the things that we're launching here today as the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader Group is our Circular Economy Awards. They're supposed to be like the Oscars for the circular economy to celebrate good practice. They're called the Circulars, and if you're interested in entering, there'll be a gala presentation and awards ceremony at Davos next year. But it's very much about celebrating good practice, because often we see a lot of negativity, but actually there are some really interesting examples out there. It includes awards for individual entrepreneurs, for smaller businesses, for larger businesses, for regions. And if you're interested in that, the website is thecirculars.org. And I'm very keen to see ASEAN, East Asia, and I think there are some great examples play a key role in that. So that's just an open invitation for people to submit to that and to Simon's offer to have very practical ideas.
So I don't think there was a question for me in what you asked, so I'll just take the liberty of just giving a personal message. I'm 55 years old. First 50 years, I was ignorant about the issues of sustainability and what it means for our future. So let me confess that. Last 5 years, I'm beginning to learn about the complexity of this issue and how it is the most important issue facing our lives, definitely facing my life. As Mark Twain said, there are 2 important days in your life: the day you were born and the day you know why you were born. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had, I think, a very good start to kick off the discussions today. We've looked, I think, broadly, but also deeply at some of the issues that are surrounding challenges corporations face when it comes to sustainability, profitability, and ongoing survivability as well. I don't think I could do it justice to sum up what we've talked about in a couple of sentences, but perhaps the more important thing is for us to continue this dialogue and to continue, as Peter mentioned right at the end, drilling down some concrete measures that we can take forward from today's discussion, and maybe then we can figure out why we were all born. So please join me in thanking Minkit, Peter, and Sunny for a very good start to today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now go for a quick 10-minute tea break, and we will be back at 11 a.m.